Oh boy, buckle up, because we're diving into one of the wildest, most chaotic, totally not okay prison meltdowns in U.S. history. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary Riot, aka the moment the correctional system threw its hands up and said, "I'm out." Picture this. It's a chilly February weekend in Santa Fe, 1980, and the Penitentiary of New Mexico is basically a pressure cooker of rage, frustration, and very poor life choices. We're talking about a place jam-packed with over 1,100 inmates, many of them stuffed into dormitories like sardines, with zero rehabilitation programs, almost no medical care, and guards who were underpaid, undertrained, and honestly, probably undercaring. So it's no surprise that something was about to snap, and snap it did, harder than a cheap pair of handcuffs. Around 1:40 a.m. on February 2nd, a few inmates decided they'd had enough of the terrible chow and being treated like livestock. They tricked some guards during a late-night head count, jumped them, and boom, within minutes, keys were stolen, control rooms were taken, and just like that, the inmates had the whole joint in their hands. What followed wasn't just a riot. It was a full-blown, apocalyptic horror movie meets revenge fantasy, minus the popcorn. Inmates went full Mad Max on each other. They broke into cell blocks, especially one called Cell Block 4, which housed the snitches, ex-cops, and folks who didn't exactly make friends in prison. Once the mob got in, it was lights out for a lot of guys. 33 inmates ended up dead, and we're not talking about quiet, peaceful goodbyes. This was gruesome, medieval-level stuff. We're talking torture, dismemberment, and just plain nightmarish violence. It got so intense that some inmates were literally begging guards to save them, and guards, some of whom had been taken hostage, were powerless to stop it. Oh yeah, did I mention the guards? About 12 of them were taken hostage in the early chaos, some beaten, some humiliated, and a few narrowly escaping death thanks to inmates who surprisingly decided to play hero. Not all prisoners were part of the madness. Some actually hid, others tried to help the wounded, and a few even risked their lives to protect staff. So, while the riot was chaos, there were flashes of humanity, buried deep in all that mayhem. Now, how did this whole nightmare end? Well, after 36 hours, yes, 36 hours of non-stop violence, destruction, and probably the worst-smelling facility in America, state police and the National Guard rolled in, gas masks and all. The inmates were exhausted. The prison was wrecked beyond recognition, and the riot eventually fizzled out. But the aftermath, yikes. The facility looked like a war zone. Walls were blackened by fires, furniture was smashed, files were torched, and blood was kind of everywhere. Investigators walked in and probably thought, yeah, we broke prison. The riot exposed just how broken the prison system was in New Mexico. Overcrowded, underfunded, mismanaged, and running on fumes. The government couldn't sweep this one under the rug. Reforms followed, reports were written, heads rolled, and the riot became a grim lesson in what happens when you ignore a boiling pot until it explodes in your face. So next time you think your workplace is chaotic, just remember, at least your coworkers aren't literally trying to eat each other. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary Riot, where everything that could go wrong absolutely did, and then somehow got even worse. Picture this: Chicago, May 21st, 1924. The city's about to be rocked by a crime so mind-boggling it'd make any true crime podcast host spill their coffee. Meet Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, two young men with brains the size of their egos. Leopold, 19, had just wrapped up his degree at the University of Chicago and was ready to tackle Harvard Law. Loeb, 18, was busy pretending to care about history while actually just wanting to make it. Together, these two genius-level troublemakers had one thing in mind: proving they were smarter than everyone else by committing the perfect crime. Inspired by Nietzsche, because of course they were, Leopold and Loeb decided they were supermen, not the cape-wearing kind, but the we're-above-the-law kind. Their goal? Kill someone, purely for kicks. No revenge, no money, Just two privileged rich kids looking for a high-risk thrill. After months of plotting, they finally picked their victim, 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a distant relative of Loeb. On May 21st, they lured Bobby into their car with the oh-so-trustworthy, "Hey kid, want a ride?" tactic. What followed was as chilling as it sounds. The details are a bit murky, but Bobby was murdered in cold blood, his body dumped in a remote area. Leopold and Loeb, feeling pretty smug about their intellectual feat, patted themselves on the back like they had just solved world peace. But wait, plot twist. To throw off the police, they sent a ransom note demanding money for Bobby's safe return. Classic move, right? Except they made one little mistake. Leopold dropped his glasses at the scene, but not just any glasses. These had a hinge so unique that only a handful existed in all of Chicago. The cops traced the glasses straight back to Leopold, and suddenly, their perfect crime started unraveling faster than a kid's science fair project. Under pressure, they cracked and admitted it wasn't about hate or money. It was a sick, twisted brain teaser. The public? Horrified. The media dubbed it the crime of the century, and Chicago couldn't believe that two privileged kids would kill an innocent child just to prove they were that smart. The trial? A circus. With the evidence piling up like a skyscraper, their defense attorney, the legendary Clarence Darrow, didn't even bother trying to claim innocence. Instead, he begged for mercy, arguing that Leopold and Loeb were just victims of their privileged upbringing and misguided intellectual ideas. The judge, perhaps feeling generous, sentenced them to life in prison plus 99 years, sparing them the death penalty. The families? They disowned them faster than you could say, "Goodbye, trust fund." Loeb's story ended in 1936 when he was killed in a prison fight. Leopold, on the other hand, became the model inmate. He studied languages, taught other prisoners, and even published scientific papers. After 33 years, he was paroled in 1958, living quietly in Puerto Rico until his death in 1971. The Leopold and Loeb case left America reeling, forcing the public to face uncomfortable truths about privilege and morality. It's even inspired films like Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, showing that even a century later, their twisted tale still fascinates and disturbs. So there you have it. Two kids who thought they were smarter than the world, only to be caught by a pair of glasses. Sometimes, the smartest guys in the room are the ones who make the biggest blunders. Let's rewind to October 2nd, 1992, São Paulo, Brazil. A day that turned one of the world's most overcrowded prisons into the site of one of the deadliest prison massacres in modern history. Welcome to the twisted, tragic tale of Caranderu Penitentiary, where a prison brawl escalated into a full-blown bloodbath, all thanks to a keep calm and call the military approach that went spectacularly wrong. Now, Caranderu wasn't your average prison. It was more like a chaotic, concrete jungle crammed with over 8,000 inmates, all squeezed into a space built for way fewer. Picture wall-to-wall prisoners, barely enough room to breathe, and the kind of living conditions that would make even a cockroach file a complaint. Diseases were rampant, the food was tragic, and the vibe? Perpetual tension. You didn't need a crystal ball to see something bad was brewing. And then, boom, a fight breaks out in Pavilion 9, which was already known as the Hot Mess Express of the entire facility. This wasn't an unusual event. Fights were basically part of the daily itinerary, but this one spiraled fast. The prison staff hit panic mode, lost control, and instead of trying to calm things down, they did what any totally not overreacting system would do. They called in the military police. Because when your overcrowded prison explodes into chaos, what could go wrong with storming in hundreds of armed officers? Well, a lot. Over 300 military police officers entered the prison, and what was supposed to be a security operation turned into a slaughter. When the dust settled, 111 prisoners were dead, most of them unarmed, many reportedly executed in cold blood. Some were gunned down in their cells, others were shot while trying to surrender. And the kicker? Not a single cop was killed or seriously hurt. That wasn't a clash. It was a massacre in every sense of the word. Leading this little horror show was Colonel Uberatan Guimaraes, who somehow went from guy who led a bloodbath to politician with a seat in office. He was convicted for his role years later, but don't cheer yet because the conviction got overturned. And in a plot twist straight out of a crime drama, he was found dead in 2006 under mysterious circumstances. No spoilers, but yeah, things got messy. The massacre triggered outrage both inside and outside Brazil. Human rights groups were furious. Journalists and activists sounded the alarm. The justice system was dragged through the mud for how long it took to hold anyone accountable. And even when some officers were finally put on trial, 2 decades later, the process felt more like a confusing soap opera than real justice. Caranderu itself was eventually shut down in 2002 and demolished. In its place stands a park and a memorial, a quiet tribute to the lives lost in a building that became a symbol of everything wrong with the prison system. Oh, and if this story sounds like something straight out of a gritty movie, that's because it is. In 2003, filmmaker Hector Babenco released Caranderu, a film that dives deep into prison life leading up to the massacre. It's raw, it's powerful, and it doesn't sugarcoat a thing. At the end of the day, the Caranderu massacre isn't just a dark moment in Brazil's past. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when authority loses its moral compass, and when lives behind bars are treated like they don't matter. It's brutal, it's real, and it's a story that demands to be remembered. Picture it. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July 22, 1991. An average evening in a seemingly average city, except for one tiny detail: the horrors unfolding behind the closed door of a rundown apartment. Inside, Jeffrey Dahmer, a 31-year-old factory worker with a bizarre and grotesque hobby, is about to meet his match. Enter Tracy Edwards, a man just trying to make it through the day, who stumbles into a nightmare that would make even the bravest shudder. Edwards' escape from Dahmer's clutches would expose a twisted reality that the world could hardly comprehend. And from that night on, Dahmer's name would become synonymous with evil. Now, Dahmer didn't just dabble in the whole serial killer business. No, he turned it into an art form. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 men. But forget the usual cliches of a killer lurking in the shadows. Dahmer was far more inventive, and I use that term loosely. His victims were often vulnerable individuals, many from marginalized communities, and Dahmer lured them with promises of money, drinks, or just a place to crash. Then came the gruesome acts: dismembering bodies, collecting souvenirs like skulls, hearts, and, oh yeah, eating them. That's right. He wasn't just a Milwaukee cannibal for nothing. Born in 1960, Dahmer seemed like a regular kid at first, but things took a dark turn after his surgery at age 4. Suddenly, Jeffrey went from cheerful to quiet and oddly distant. By his teenage years, he swapped his baseball cards for dead animals, collecting bones and preserving carcasses like he was auditioning for a twisted version of National Geographic. In 1978, fresh out of high school, Dahmer took his first victim, Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he picked up and brought home. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer had other plans. He struck him with a dumbbell and strangled him. Then, in what was the first of many, he dismembered the body and scattered the remains in the woods. 8 years passed before Dahmer killed again, but when he did, he didn't hold back. From 1987 to 1991, Dahmer went full throttle on his killing spree. He targeted young men, often meeting them at gay bars or bus stops, preying on those whose disappearances would go unnoticed. Once he lured them to his apartment, the real horror began: drugging, strangling, dismembering, and even drilling holes into their skulls to create zombies. Spoiler alert, that didn't work. Oh, and the cannibalism? Just a side dish to the horror buffet. Then came the fateful night in July 1991. Tracy Edwards managed to escape Dahmer's apartment, still in shock from the close call of nearly being handcuffed to a pole. In his panic, he flagged down police, and when they searched Dahmer's apartment, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. Dismembered bodies, photos of victims at various stages of death, a human skull in the fridge, and body parts in the freezer. Dahmer was arrested on the spot, and as the weeks passed, he openly confessed to killing 17 people, giving details that made the world gasp. Wisconsin doesn't have the death penalty, so in 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life terms, later bumped to 16. Despite expressing a desire to die, Dahmer would spend the rest of his days behind bars. But even in prison, Dahmer couldn't resist being, well, Dahmer. He joked about his crimes, molded his food into body parts, and generally freaked out anyone who crossed his path. Predictably, he didn't win any popularity contests. On November 28, 1994, while on cleaning duty with 2 other inmates, Dahmer met his end. Christopher Scarver, armed with a metal bar, beat him to death in a fit of rage. Many believe the guards knew exactly what was about to happen and turned a blind eye. Dahmer's death sparked mixed reactions. Some saw it as poetic justice, while others, including the families of his victims, wrestled with more complicated feelings. And so, the reign of the Milwaukee cannibal ended, but the name Jeffrey Dahmer will forever be etched in history as one of the darkest figures in true crime. One of the darkest, most disturbing events in Sri Lanka's modern history, a massacre that didn't happen in a war zone, but behind the high walls of a prison. This is the story of the Wayada prison massacre, a brutal and haunting episode that unfolded during the chaos of Black July 1983, when the country was gripped by deadly ethnic violence and lawlessness. In July 1983, Sri Lanka was a nation on edge. Tensions between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority had been simmering for years, with political mistrust, social discrimination, and rising militancy all fueling the fire. When 13 Sinhalese soldiers were killed by the Tamil Tigers in an ambush in the north, the reaction was swift and violent. Riots exploded across the country in what became known as Black July. Tamil homes, shops, and lives were destroyed by Sinhalese mobs in broad daylight, while authorities either turned a blind eye or failed to intervene. The country was on fire, both literally and figuratively. Amid this chaos stood Wayada Prison in Colombo, one of the largest and most secure prison facilities in the country. Inside its walls were Tamil political prisoners and suspected militants, many of whom had been detained under emergency laws. They were held in state custody, stripped of their freedom, but still under the protection of the law. That protection, however, was tragically absent when the violence reached inside those prison walls. On July 25, 1983, the first massacre occurred. A group of Sinhalese inmates, somehow armed with weapons, launched a brutal and coordinated attack on the Tamil prisoners. What followed was a horrifying bloodbath. 35 Tamil inmates were killed, hacked and beaten to death in what should have been a controlled and secure environment. The guards, whose job was to maintain order and safety, either failed to act or disappeared altogether. Locked doors were inexplicably left open. Weapons that shouldn't have existed in a prison were suddenly in the hands of attackers, and the violence unfolded with disturbing ease. After this massacre, authorities promised tighter security. Extra guards were assigned. Everyone expected the worst to be over. But just 2 days later, on July 27th, the violence returned with horrifying familiarity. Another 18 Tamil prisoners were killed in a second wave of attacks. That brought the total death toll to 53. These were not spontaneous outbursts of violence. They were targeted killings, carried out with shocking coordination and apparent complicity. Despite the scale of the atrocity, accountability never followed. No prison officials faced meaningful consequences. No thorough investigation was made public. The story faded into the background, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and political silence. The massacre became a symbol, not just of racial hatred, but of the utter breakdown of justice and institutional responsibility. The Wayada prison massacre didn't happen in some remote jungle or in the fog of war. It happened in the heart of the capital, under the nose of the state, inside a prison where every movement was supposed to be monitored. The fact that such a tragedy could occur in such a setting spoke volumes about the environment of the time. one where fear, racism, and violence had replaced order and accountability. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, no justice, no one to answer for what happened. The massacre left a permanent scar, not just on those who lost their loved ones, but on the conscience of an entire nation. It exposed the depth of ethnic division and the extent to which state institutions could fail or refuse to protect those in their custody. Even today, the Wayada prison massacre remains one of the most brutal examples of state negligence in Sri Lanka's post-independence history. It stands as a grim reminder of what can happen when hate is allowed to fester and when the guardians of justice become bystanders to murder. This was not just a prison riot. It was an organized massacre that reflected the darkest impulses of a society in collapse. The names of the 53 Tamil prisoners may not be widely known, but their story deserves to be told, not as a forgotten tragedy, but as a warning, a lesson, and a call to never let history repeat itself. On a scorching day in Tucson, Arizona, May 31, 1964, the city's darkest secret began to unravel, all thanks to a man who was as bizarre as he was dangerous. Meet Charles Schmid, the Pied Piper of Tucson. Standing at a mere 5'3", with a little help from shoe lifts, Schmid had a magnetic charm that drew local teens, especially young girls, to his side. With his dyed black hair and fake mole, he channeled Elvis Presley, but behind that quirky facade was a monster no one saw coming. Born on July 8, 1942, Schmid had a somewhat normal childhood, adopted by Charles and Catherine Schmid, who ran a nursing home. His parents' rocky marriage and eventual divorce left lasting scars, and school wasn't his strong suit, although he excelled in gymnastics. But his senior year was a mess. He quit gymnastics, got expelled for stealing, and drifted aimlessly. With no diploma and no plans, Schmid became a regular on Tucson's Speedway Boulevard, cruising in a car funded by his mom's $300 monthly allowance. Schmid had style, or at least an eccentric version of it. Teens, drawn to his odd confidence, followed him like moths to a flame. But on May 31, 1964, his true nature revealed itself. Schmid, along with his girlfriend Mary French and his friend John Saunders, lured 15-year-old Aline Rowe into a trap. French invited Rowe on a double date, and trusting her new friends, Rowe went along. Once in the desert, Schmid attacked Rowe with a rock, while French stayed in the car, blasting music. Afterward, Schmid and Saunders buried Rowe, sure they'd gotten away with murder. For a while, they did. Teen runaways were common in the 60s, and Rowe's disappearance was dismissed, but Schmid couldn't resist bragging about his crime. His confidant, Richie Bruns, was horrified but too scared to act. Tragically, Rowe wasn't the last. In 1965, Schmid escalated his violence, killing his girlfriend Gretchen Fritz and her 13-year-old sister Wendy when Gretchen threatened to expose him. He buried them in the desert and once again bragged to Bruns. This time, Bruns fled Tucson and contacted the police. With his testimony, authorities arrested Schmid in November 1965. The Pied Piper was finally caught. Convicted in February 1966, Schmid received a death sentence, later reduced to life in prison. In 1975, fellow inmates stabbed Schmid, and after 20 agonizing days, he died on March 30th. Charles Schmid's story is a chilling reminder that even the most charming people can hide the darkest secrets. One of the most shocking and brutal prison riots in Brazil's recent history, the Alameira prison riot of 2019. This wasn't just a scuffle behind bars. It was a full-scale eruption of violence, fueled by gang rivalry, overcrowding, and a prison system that was already hanging by a thread. What happened in Alameira shocked the world, and for good reason. So, it all started on July 29, 2019, in the Centro de Recuperação Regional de Altamira, located in the northern state of Pará, Brazil. On the surface, it was a typical morning inside the facility, at least as typical as things can be in an overcrowded prison. But beneath the surface, tension was bubbling between two major rival gangs, the local Commando Class A (CCA), and the nationally feared Comando Vermelho (CV) from Rio de Janeiro. At around 7 a.m., that tension exploded into violence. Members of the CCA launched a surprise attack on CV members, catching them off guard. But this wasn't just fists and threats. The attackers locked a group of CV members in a section of the prison and set it on fire. Flames tore through the makeshift cell blocks, many of which were modified shipping containers, and smoke filled the air. The heat was intense and the fire quickly spread out of control. The result? Absolute horror. 57 inmates died inside the prison, many due to smoke inhalation, but at least 16 were brutally decapitated. That level of violence is hard to even imagine. The aftermath was worse. 4 more inmates died during transportation to other facilities, bringing the final death toll to 62. The riot wasn't just deadly, it was savage. Prison staff were powerless to stop it. There were only 33 guards overseeing more than 340 inmates that day, more than double the prison's intended capacity of 163. 2 staff members were briefly taken hostage during the chaos but were later released. For hours, police forces and emergency responders couldn't even get inside the building due to the flames, and the violence still unfolding. It was a complete breakdown of control. This riot didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of years of neglect, systemic overcrowding, poor infrastructure, and unchecked gang influence within Brazil's prisons. The conditions at Alameira were a disaster waiting to happen. When you cram hundreds of gang-affiliated inmates into a small, understaffed space and then house them in flammable, poorly ventilated units, it's not a question of if something will go wrong, but when. In the days that followed, authorities scrambled to respond. 46 inmates were transferred to other facilities, 10 of them to high-security prisons. Officials promised to review prison conditions and address gang-related violence, but for many critics it was too little, too late. This riot wasn't the first, and sadly, it wasn't the last. Brazil's prison system has long struggled with violence, overcrowding, and corruption. The Wayada Massacre forced the world to take a hard look at what was happening behind closed doors. It became a symbol, not just of a failed facility, but of a failed system, and until those root causes are addressed, incidents like this will continue to happen. So, while it's easy to see this as just another headline from a faraway place, the Alameira riot is a harsh reminder of what can happen when broken systems are ignored. It's not just a story about criminals behind bars. It's a story about policy, humanity, and the high cost of neglect. Here's a chilling story that sounds like it could be ripped from a horror movie, but this happened in real life, in one of the UK's most secure prisons. Let me set the scene. It's October 1st, 2011, and we're at Franklin Prison, a fortress of a facility housing some of the most dangerous criminals in Britain. Among them was Mitchell Harrison, a 23-year-old with a record so dark it could blot out the sun. Harrison was serving an indefinite sentence after luring a 13-year-old girl to his apartment and committing horrific crimes that landed him on every judge's significant risk list. But while his crimes shocked the public, what happened to him behind bars left even hardened prison guards speechless. Enter Nathan Mann, 24, and Michael Parr, 33, 2 walking nightmares in human form. Mann, a violent fantasist serving life for the brutal double murder of elderly women in a nursing home, had confessed to dreaming up the goriest killings imaginable. Oh, and just to make things worse, he had a cannibalism fixation. Lovely. Parr wasn't much better. He was doing time for attempting to suffocate a hospital patient back in 2003. Bonded by their shared taste for violence, these two formed a diabolical duo that would make villains in horror films seem tame. On that fateful October morning, Mann and Parr hatched a plan that was as brutal as it was bizarre. They lured Harrison into Mann's cell, where the true horror began. Parr held Harrison down while Mann wielded makeshift weapons, a razor blade melted into plastic, and, because why not, a pen. It was quick, vicious, and deeply disturbing. They planned to remove Harrison's liver and eat it. Yes, you heard that right. But, for reasons known only to them, they didn't go through with their gruesome culinary aspirations. By the time prison guards discovered Harrison's lifeless body, it was far too late. The injuries were so horrifying that even seasoned staff were visibly shaken, and if you thought Mann and Parr would show any signs of remorse, think again. Mann casually informed a guard about the body as if he were reporting a spilled cup of coffee. Their explanation for the murder? They just felt like doing it. Chilling doesn't even begin to cover it. Of course, the aftermath of the murder raised serious questions about how such a brutal killing could happen inside one of the UK's most secure prisons. Mann and Parr were both known to be extraordinarily violent. Mann, in particular, had openly admitted to his twisted fantasies, yet here they were, left unsupervised and free to act on their sick desires. When the case went to court, the judge didn't mince words, calling the crime ghastly and gruesome. Mann and Parr were handed additional life sentences, not that they were going anywhere to begin with. The judge made it clear that society would never see them walk free again. This case isn't just a tale of horror. It's a grim reminder of the chilling indifference that some people carry and the glaring flaws in even the most secure systems. For Mitchell Harrison, justice didn't end in a courtroom. It caught up with him in the darkest, bloodiest corner of Franklin Prison. Let's rewind to 1971, to a small town in upstate New York where something explosive was brewing inside the walls of Attica Correctional Facility. Overcrowded, under-resourced, and racially divided, the prison had become a pressure cooker. Inmates were living under harsh conditions, only one shower a week, barely any medical care, censored mail, and a diet that could have made cardboard look appetizing. More than half the prison population was Black or Latino, but almost all the guards were white, and racism was practically baked into the system. Tensions had been simmering for years, and on September 9th, the lid finally blew off. It started with a scuffle between inmates and guards, but what followed was far more than just a fight. Over 1,200 inmates took control of the prison's D-yard, taking 42 staff members hostage. But instead of descending into chaos, the inmates organized. They issued a clear and powerful list of 27 demands, calling for basic human rights: decent food, health care, education, fair treatment, and amnesty for the uprising. They weren't asking for luxury, they were asking for dignity. For 4 tense days, the prison yard turned into a political stage. The inmates brought in observers, activists, journalists, even public figures like civil rights attorney William Kunstler and Black Panther leader Bobby Seale to help with negotiations. Their message was firm, but peaceful. They were determined to be heard. But outside the walls, Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to meet the inmates face-to-face, despite public pressure. And on the morning of September 13th, without warning, he gave the green light for a violent retake. In came hundreds of heavily armed state troopers, correction officers, and sheriff's deputies. Tear gas rained down. Guns opened fire. Chaos erupted. In just 15 minutes, 39 people were killed, 29 inmates and 10 hostages. And here's the chilling truth. Every single hostage was killed by law enforcement gunfire, not by the inmates. Despite this, officials initially claimed the prisoners had murdered the hostages, an outright lie that was quickly exposed by autopsies. The public was outraged. What followed was a storm of lawsuits, investigations, and long-overdue scrutiny of the U.S. prison system. The Attica uprising became a defining moment, a symbol of resistance against inhumane treatment behind bars, and a stark reminder of how quickly justice can unravel when fear takes over. The prisoners had tried to negotiate. They had asked to be heard. Instead, their cries were met with bullets. Decades later, Attica is still more than just the name of a prison. It's a powerful warning, a call to remember what happens when systems fail and voices are ignored. It forced the nation to confront ugly truths about racism, inequality, and brutality in places most people never see. And while some reforms did come in its wake, many of the same issues, overcrowding, neglect, abuse, still linger in prisons across the country. It's 1977 in Quebec, Canada, the age of disco, bell-bottoms, and apparently a booming market for self-proclaimed prophets. Meet Roche Thériault, a man in his 30s who believed God had handpicked him to save humanity. Raised in a strict religious household, Roche was basically a walking Old Testament encyclopedia. He dropped out of school early, clung tightly to apocalyptic prophecies, and was absolutely convinced the world was gearing up for a divine showdown between good and evil. To prep for this holy smackdown, he joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, embracing their clean-living lifestyle. No booze, no smokes, no fun. But here's the plot twist. Roche didn't exactly stay on the straight and narrow. Armed with charisma and a silver tongue, Roche began hosting religious seminars that were less about theology and more about recruitment. Before long, he'd amassed a group of devoted followers who quit their jobs, abandoned their families, and joined Roche in forming a commune. He dubbed them the Ant Hill Kids, inspired by their relentless work ethic. Cute, right? At first, life in the commune seemed wholesome. They baked bread, sang songs, and treated Roche like Moses leading them to the promised land. But paradise quickly spiraled into a hellscape. Roche's behavior turned dark. He ditched his clean-living vows, started drinking again, and laid down rules that made the Old Testament stone tablets look like gentle guidelines. Want to talk to your family? Forbidden. Want to chat with each other? Not without Roche's permission. Breaking the rules earned punishments ranging from savage beatings to being strung up from the ceiling like some nightmarish chandelier. And as Roche's mental state unraveled, his punishments grew increasingly horrifying. Fast forward to 1979, when Roche predicted the apocalypse was imminent. Naturally, he relocated the Ant Hill Kids to the remote Quebec wilderness to ride out the end of days. Spoiler, the world did not, in fact, end. But Roche shrugged and told his followers, God's timeline is complicated. Astonishingly, they bought it and stayed. Life in the woods, however, was anything but divine. Roche ruled with an iron fist, or perhaps a sledgehammer, considering he once forced followers to break their own legs with one. Punishments included eating dead rats, burning themselves on stoves, and, in one jaw-dropping case, nailing children to trees for other kids to pelt with stones. If you think it can't get worse, think again. One of Roche's followers, Solange Boilard, complained of stomach pain. Roche, ever the wannabe surgeon, decided to operate. Armed with kitchen tools and a blowtorch, he removed part of her intestines in a procedure that would make even horror movie fans wince. Unsurprisingly, Solange didn't survive. But Roche wasn't done. He drilled a hole in her skull in a bizarre resurrection attempt. Shocker. It didn't work. Even after this macabre spectacle, the group remained loyal. Enter Gabrielle Lavallee, the unsung hero of this nightmare. Gabrielle endured years of abuse, including having her teeth pulled out and her arm amputated by Roche with a hunting knife. That last act was her breaking point. She escaped and alerted authorities, finally pulling back the curtain on Roche's reign of terror. In 1989, the police stormed the commune, arrested Roche, and rescued the remaining followers. By 1993, Roche was sentenced to life for murder and other atrocities. But karma wasn't finished. In 2011, his cellmate, fed up with Roche's antics, murdered him in prison, leaving his body mutilated as a final act of poetic justice. Despite his gruesome end, some followers stayed loyal, visiting his grave and clinging to his twisted teachings. For the rest of us, Roche's story is a grim reminder of the deadly combination of blind faith and unchecked power.